Sometime after sunset, a group of men gathered together in Kandahar to savor the moment they made history. Televisions had been banned in Afghanistan, but these men were honored guests. Osama Bin Laden and his Al-Qaeda faithful were there to watch the horror of 9/11 unfold. What Al-Qaeda call the Manhattan Raid. So the West invaded Afghanistan.
There was a belief it could be done quickly, with a very light footprint. We could be in and we could be out again. And we ended up doing neither one thing nor the other.
Instead, 47 nations, America and Britain especially, have been sucked ever deeper into a quagmire.
Oh, I used to ask myself every time I went to Afghanistan, what are we doing here?
In the first of 3 programs marking 10 years of war in Afghanistan, I've been examining some of the key decisions that have shaped the conflict. A conflict that's cost many thousands of lives, including more than 370 British servicemen and women.
With the right attention, the right strategy, and the right resources, the war would be over and most of our boys would be home. But we didn't do it.
It's important to give people a clear idea that there is an end to this.
So, will the death of Osama bin Laden, who started the Afghan war, bring us any closer to an end? 2 years before 9/11, Afghanistan's UN envoy arrived in New York. There, he handed in his resignation.
I went to the Security Council and said, look, I have done everything I know, and it has got us nowhere. I haven't got anywhere because you are not supporting me. You are not interested in Afghanistan. But you are wrong.
Afghanistan had become a pariah state. The Taliban government had allowed Al-Qaeda to establish its base there, from where Osama bin Laden had declared a holy war on Jews and Christians. The Taliban shared with Al-Qaeda its medieval version of Islam. The United Nations had been trying to persuade the Taliban to kick out Al-Qaeda. Their envoy had had a rare meeting with the Taliban leader, Mullah Omar, a veteran of the war against the Russian invaders of the 1980s.
Very shy man. He had lost an eye, and he was very much aware of that, so he kept always playing with his hand like this. Very, very soft-spoken. I told him, look, this group have an agenda that has nothing to do with Afghanistan, and that will create a lot of problems for you. He said, Osama bin Laden, he is our guest.
In Afghanistan, bin Laden was more than just a guest. As a wealthy Saudi, he helped bankroll the Taliban regime. Mullah Omar refused to disown his friend and benefactor. Lakhdar Brahimi's mission had failed. He warned the Security Council that by ignoring Afghanistan, they were storing up trouble.
You are wrong to think that this is a small country, a faraway country. What happens there is irrelevant. It will blow in our faces.
The impact of 9/11 cannot be understated. It was the deadliest attack against America in its history. With nearly 3,000 dead, it was inevitable that America would strike back.
The people who knock these buildings down will hear all of us soon.
Prompting America to invade Afghanistan was exactly what Osama bin Laden was hoping for on September 11th. His son has told us, in retrospect, my father's dream was to get America to invade Afghanistan.
To me, it's just common sense, though. Obviously, you gotta go get the guy.
America gave the Taliban every chance to avoid war. All they had to do was hand over bin Laden.
If bin Laden's the guy we want, then the assassination team out and get him.
It was a serious effort to persuade the Taliban, you do not want to go down with al-Qaeda. If you'll hand these guys over, our war isn't with you.
The Taliban response was that their ancient hospitality code trumped all other considerations.
It was a no, that we're not going to separate ourselves from our traditional hospitality and welcoming of guests.
It's hard for us to understand that when you're dealing with a man like Osama bin Laden.
It happens like that.
It happened like that.
Yes. The life of the guest is protected by the lives of the hosts.
Nearly 4 weeks after 9/11, America's patience ran out. The president told his generals to unleash holy hell.
On my orders, the United States military has begun strikes against the al-Qaeda terrorist training camps and military installations of the Taliban regime in Afghanistan.
America was determined not to get bogged down in Afghanistan, so there was no large ground invasion, no heavy armor. Instead, America relied on CIA operatives, precision, speed, just 1,800 troops, and buying up Afghan militias. Its plan was war light.
We sent in 20 or 30 CIA officers with several $1 million in walking around money and bought the Northern Alliance over to our side.
The Northern Alliance was a coalition of warlords which had once ruled much of Afghanistan. They were a ragtag militia, now aligned to the world's most sophisticated fighting force. In the 1990s, the Northern Alliance had lost to the Taliban in a civil war costing tens of thousands of lives. The tables were now turning. On the 13th of November 2001, just 5 weeks after the invasion, the Northern Alliance captured the capital, Kabul. It looked like the war was over.
That's not what Osama bin Laden thought was going to happen. He thought it was going to be a long, protracted guerrilla struggle. He was surprised.
The celebrations in Kabul concealed a mass of underlying tribal and sectarian tensions. The Northern Alliance represented ethnic groups in the north. The Taliban were drawn from the majority Pashtun of the south. To avoid another inter-ethnic civil war, Afghanistan needed a leader acceptable to both the north and the south. That leader was a Pashtun who teamed up with US Special Forces at a secret airbase near the Pakistan border. His name was Hamid Karzai.
In 2001, my mission was to link up with Hamid Karzai. I liked him immediately. I can't say I've worked with many Afghan warlords before, so maybe they're all equally personable. But Karzai was a very modest man, very polite.
Captain Amarine's mission was to help Karzai raise an army against the Taliban. The Taliban had retreated south and were regrouping for a last stand in their spiritual home in Kandahar. During a chaotic day of fighting, Karzai and Amarine learned that hundreds of Taliban fighters were closing in on them.
Basically, as all hell was breaking loose and we're waiting for the Taliban to overrun our location and kill everybody, Karzai was standing out there in the street, calmly directing people and trying to gather up guerrillas to fight with us. He was definitely cool under pressure. We received a phone call late at night. Everybody was asleep except me and Karzai. After he hung up, it was like, you know, oh, who is that? And he says to me, oh, that was an intermediary from Mullah Omar. And I kind of did a double take. I'm like, what did Mullah Omar want?
The Taliban leader wanted to explore the terms of a surrender. Provided the Taliban returned peacefully to their homes, the war would be over. At least, that's what the Taliban say Hamid Karzai promised Mullah Omar.
He promised to him that this is your country, to live in your country peacefully with all your natural rights and the human rights. But they were not allowed to live peacefully in this country.
Washington rejected a deal with the Taliban. Their Afghan mission was kill or capture, and they made no distinction between the Taliban and Al-Qaeda.
Do you think that was a mistake?
I do. Certainly below the level of Mullah Omar, to have considered a political approach which would have offered the Taliban possibilities to participate in the political process, provided that they would cut their ties with international terrorism. I think that history will judge that a missed opportunity.
Because Washington wanted to get in and out of Afghanistan swiftly, there were few US troops to chase the fleeing Al-Qaeda and Taliban leaders. The hunt for Osama bin Laden took special forces to a network of caves close to the Pakistan border.
This top hill, very top up there, that's supposedly where bin Laden's hanging out.
The Americans had deployed less than 100 troops with which to seal all routes out of these vast mountains. Bin Laden slipped away, as did the Taliban leaders.
We took our eye off the ball and gave Osama bin Laden and Mullah Omar a remarkable second chance. And in one of the most brilliant military comebacks of modern times, the Taliban went from the ashes of defeat to being on the outskirts of Kabul in a matter of less than a decade.
Any hope that the Afghan war would be brief vanished when bin Laden and Mullah Omar slipped across the border into Pakistan's Pashtun tribal lands. Greeting the fugitives were not only friends and family, but also elements of Pakistan's military intelligence, sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, and who'd also helped the Taliban win the Afghan civil war in the 1990s.
They wanted the government in Kabul that was under their influence and control, and which was not under the influence of India. They had given them their first batch of serious weaponry, ammunition, money. There were Pakistani military officers who were working and serving with the Taliban.
After 9/11, Pakistan's president, Pervez Musharraf, bowed to American pressure and promised to cut his government's ties to the Taliban.
The Bush administration was ecstatic when Musharraf agreed to switch sides after September 11th. President Bush is a man who believes very strongly in personal relationships, and he believed that he and General Musharraf had developed a strong bond between them.
Many Al-Qaeda members were arrested. Not so the Taliban High Command. Mullah Omar and his fellow fugitive leaders were reported to be living openly in the border city of Quetta.
Right on the outskirts of Quetta, there is the biggest refugee camp, about 100,000 people. Now this is the center of everything. And control
the
on
center
the
of the Taliban
Yes, centers of anyone coming and going, any terrorist coming and
Any
going.
jihadi group.
Yeah, anyone could come there and go. Can you differentiate between a Taliban or a refugee? No, sir, you cannot. They are the same beards, carrying weapons. So it's the same people.
In Kabul, the Afghan intelligence service did not accept there was an innocent explanation to Mullah Omar's presence. From the outset, there was deep distrust of Pakistan's motives.
The Taliban leadership were hibernating in Pakistan. They were not defeated or killed. The Americans received verbal assurances from President Musharraf that Pakistan will cooperate, but they kept the Taliban intact. I mean the leadership of the Taliban.
I learned over time in dealing with President Musharraf that he would literally tell me the truth. I had an occasion where I asked him to dismantle a certain terrorist camp that was directed towards Kashmir. And after we wrangled a bit about it, he agreed.
And he did?
He
dismantle it?
He did dismantle it. However, he remantled it a couple of kilometers away. So when I went back to him, I said, now, this time I've got to ask you to dismantle this terrorist camp. So let's say you have 12 in total. Tomorrow there'll be 11, and every day after this there'll be 11. Okay, I agree, and he did it.
Terrorists who once occupied Afghanistan now occupy cells at Guantanamo Bay.
4 months after 9/11, there was a feeling in Washington of mission accomplished. Liberated from the austerity of the Taliban regime, Afghans celebrated the birth of new freedoms, a free press, a role for women, and eventually the first democratically elected head of state. But the Americans had made it clear from the start that they weren't there to rebuild Afghanistan. That was a job for Hamid Karzai's new government.
The U.S. insisted that public safety in Afghanistan should be a responsibility for the Afghans, despite the fact that at this point the country had no army and no police force.
The U.S. Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, said it would be a fool's errand to get more involved in a tribal society as complex as Afghanistan.
Rumsfeld said U.S. forces would use their influence to prevent outright fighting, but that nobody would do peacekeeping or public security outside Kabul.
Get that in Colchester, would you?
Britain led the first group of international forces to assist with the security of Kabul. That left 80% of the country, more than twice the size of the UK, unsecured.
Who did Secretary Rumsfeld think then was going to keep law and order if it wasn't going to be a stabilization
My
force?
view is he did not care.
How did he imagine that stability was going to arise out of
I don't think he cared about stability. He was intent, and give him his credit, on dismantling and destroying Al Qaeda. I don't think he was intent at all on what the Afghanistan of the future would look like.
It was generally right not to put ourselves in the business of trying to govern a very foreign country for which we had neither the cultural nor the linguistic capacity to do it, and which would have dragged us into Afghan quarrels, and pretty soon we would be the problem, not as an occupying power, but it's beyond our competence. On the other hand, I think we should have done more to build up the Afghan capability to provide for their own security.
force.
If there's one thing I would wish we had done, it was to use the time when things were relatively quiet.
Karzai had no militia of his own. His interim government, brokered by the UN, included warlords, the same people whose violence and corruption had given rise to the Taliban. While they occupied cabinet seats in Kabul, their militias filled the power vacuum outside.
People forget that he didn't create this administration. We did, with the international community, including the United Nations, including myself. We formed this government, and we told him, please come to Kabul and lead this group.
We allied ourselves with former warlords, and our objective was to destroy Al Qaeda And we very much then created and empowered a group of political actors not accountable, and also people who, as they grew in power, actually caused more instability.
In all this, the Taliban, who just months earlier had been the government of Afghanistan, seemed to have just vanished.
I was one of the people who was saying, look, where are the Taliban? These people controlled 90% of the country a few weeks ago.
And what was the response?
The response was, it's useless. You said, they have been defeated, it's gone, finished, they will never come back.
Within 6 months of the invasion, Britain and America began to avert their gaze from Afghanistan, preoccupied by another matter: preparations for the war in Iraq.
The biggest single mistake, just one, probably Iraq. We didn't know then. The most important player in Afghanistan, to the Americans, was absent-minded from day one, was looking somewhere else.
The world was now focused almost exclusively on Iraq, while Taliban gunmen started to cross the porous border into southern Afghanistan. It was March 2003, just 18 months after the invasion. The Taliban were back.
The Taliban went into Kandahar, and they were looking for targets. And, there were very few targets. I mean, there were just Afghans living there. There were no foreign troops there. There were a few Afghan government representatives who really weren't worth killing as far as the Taliban were concerned in those early days. So the Taliban just went further and further in to Afghanistan looking for targets.
The United Nations in Afghanistan has ordered its staff not to travel by road through the area where an international Red Cross worker was murdered last Thursday.
He was ordered out of his car by a group of armed men and then shot.
You had American generals sending off cables saying, something is happening, sending cables even to Rumsfeld. And I think Rumsfeld ignored them. The White House ignored them.
We clearly have moved from major combat activity to a period of stability and stabilization and reconstruction and activities.
It was the forgotten war of 2002 to 2005. The Taliban were reorganizing. They were licking their wounds and figuring out what to do next. There wasn't a heavy British or coalition loss, and the country seemed to be relatively stable. It wasn't a war on the front pages.
And yet, the Afghan war was far from over. In fact, it was about to reignite. By 2005, NATO was in control and did what Washington had so opposed at the start. They increased troop numbers and inched towards nation building. NATO wanted to extend the authority of the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai, beyond Kabul. Britain took on Helmand province.
It was suggested that I should go down to this place called Lashkargah. And everybody said, look, it's not entirely safe, but you'll be okay.
Boarding an old Russian helicopter, Britain's Foreign Office minister decided to take a look for himself at Lashkargah, capital of Helmand province.
And as we came into Lashkargah, I saw down below me this Beaugest fort. The commander was a guy called Colonel Hogberg. I said, what's it like here? And he said, well, sir, it ain't the end of the earth, but you can see it from here. He said, you could be wandering into a fight between two tribes or sub-tribes or villages over water rights. You could run into a drugs convoy. And he pointed out to me some of these drugs columns actually had anti-aircraft missiles on them. You could be running into Taliban or just a village that didn't like strangers. He said, we don't hang around because you never know who's shooting at you. I mean, this really struck me at the time as being an observation we ought to take a bit of notice of.
Helmand had little infrastructure, few public services, no functioning security, economy, or justice system. The Blair government's vision for Helmand, however, did not lack for ambition.
The original vision was that Karzai would be able to create a growing and sustainable peace, and that this would create a space in which governance would spread. And some people likened this to creating Belgium in a couple of years.
A team of experts was dispatched to Helmand by Whitehall in late 2005. Their task was to plan the delivery of this vision, with troops providing protection and expected home in just 3 years.
It was a task of biblical proportions. It was a medieval province, vast open spaces. There was no infrastructure. I remember flying across the province's only road. Corruption ran from top to bottom. So when one looked at all of this, one saw a rudderless expanse of not much, where the principal economy was drugs.
Some estimates said that 80% of the population were illiterate, and that extended to many key functions in government, including the director of education, who could not read or write.
We didn't know how many police stations there were, and the chief of police wasn't really sure either. There were sporadic outbursts of violence because of the drug trafficking. And when I asked the American officer what background research I should do to understand Helmand a little better, he said I should watch The Sopranos.
On their return home for Christmas, the planners met up with their Whitehall masters. The planners told them their vision for Helmand was unrealistic.
The overwhelming impression I had of that afternoon was of the clock ticking.
The conclusion that this was not achievable in 3 years was not an acceptable conclusion.
There was an unforgiving timeline, and there was no time for discussion.
The planners were told to get on with it, but they weren't the only ones asking awkward questions. The Foreign Office Minister wrote to the Ministry of Defence.
We had planned to go down there with 3,300 troops. We had 30,000 in Northern Ireland. Are we sure that we're going to be able to do something about this? And have we got enough helicopters? Have we got enough water? Can we do all of this?
The generals said yes, yes, and yes. The military momentum was unstoppable. Britain was going to Helmand, come what may. 16 Air Assault was the brigade chosen to provide protection for the reconstruction mission. They did anticipate some fighting.
There was an awful lot of grenade launcher practice going on down the ranges. And there wasn't much of a queue for the development brief. There are a lot of stripped-down vehicles going past with 50 cals on the top. This was, I think, every soldier's dream, Afghanistan. Hugely historically resonant, extraordinary country, classic soldiering. Perhaps as a former soldier myself, I understand that. My sense was that they had come with a larger place in the plan for malleting the Taliban.
No, I mean, I dispute that. I mean, I'd been in the military for 24 years. I'd been on a lot of operations. I knew the consequences of the wrong use of force. I'd been in Afghanistan twice before.
The force deployed gave a maximum of only 800 fighting soldiers, so the reconstruction mission was limited to the central area of Helmand, around the capital, Lashkargah.
Out on patrol in Helmand, the British troops have arrived and are introducing themselves to their new neighbours.
I'm good, fine, thank you. How are you?
Does he understand why the British soldiers are in Lashkar?
No, sir, he doesn't know.
From the moment that troops arrived, Helmand's Afghan governor warned that his authority was being undermined by lawless gunmen in the north. He urged the army to deal with them.
His argument was very much on the case saying, I need you to make sure that the flag of Afghanistan flies over all of the district centres.
Yeah. Did you resist that to begin with or not?
We did. We made it very clear that we were going to be extremely limited in our capability to do other operations.
The generals in London judged that deploying north was unsustainable, but the Helmand governor persevered and was supported by the British Embassy in Kabul and the Secret Intelligence Service. By late May, the generals relented. The order was given to defend positions up to 70 miles from the reconstruction area. By late June, the army was thinly spread across 3 new flashpoints and about to stretch to yet a 4th, the town of Sangin.
There were no angels in Sangin. There were 2 warring drug cartels, effectively, in Sangin. And here we were about to deploy British troops in between those 2 drugs cartels. I did everything I possibly could to engage anyone who had decision-making authority to say, this is madness, this cannot be happening.
But it was. The arrival of the troops stirred up a hornet's nest.
I was furious watching that type of decision-making that ended up uprooting the entire plan that we'd devised.
The summer of 2006 saw the British Army engaged in some of its fiercest fighting in half a century.
Watch it shoot! Watch it shoot! Pass up the grenade!
How does this compare to Iraq?
Oh, it's a lot worse. It's a lot better. No, we didn't see any action in Iraq. About here, it's more or less every day can guarantee small arms fire incoming, like.
Pinned down in a series of Alamos across the north of Helmand, British soldiers became magnets for attacks from the Taliban, drug gangs, and locals just angry at the presence of foreigners.
A lot of the people we were killing were effectively the farmers who'd had AK-47s put in their hands by the Taliban leadership.
Part-time Talibs, really?
Part-time Talibs. Part-time Talibs are not very well-trained ones, and we killed huge numbers of them. And I don't think that was to our liking at all. And we were conscious that really for every one we killed, we were probably actually fueling the insurgency.
The general responsible for overseeing day-to-day operations in Helmand was Sir Peter Ward, now head of the British Army.
The mission changed dramatically.
No, I don't think the mission did change, actually.
Really?
No. It changed in what, do you mean the aim changed?
Well,
or the mode of delivery changed?
Well, it changed in the sense that the original mission was a sort of hearts and minds, we'll help bring governance mission to this limited area in the centre of Helmand. And within a matter of weeks, 16 air assault were fighting for their lives in a series of Alamos, and no governance, none at all, taking place.
Had we not gone north, what would have happened in your estimation?
That's not for me to say. What you were in charge of the operational decision.
Yeah.
So what's your estimation?
I think Afghan governance in Helmand would have collapsed. I think you'd have seen the Taliban breaking out, and you'd have had your Alamos in different parts of Helmand.
The original mission was to win hearts and minds. You would accept, I guess, that if only because we needed to protect our soldiers, that quite a lot of Afghan hearts were lost in the process.
Undoubtedly. Yeah, undoubtedly. I accept that.
This guy's IDing these here and saying the Taliban. Where's the room name? Yeah? 2 men. Yeah, there. Taliban, yeah?
How much of your original plan did you manage to implement?
Not really very much.
I think after the first 18 months of hard fighting, understanding the challenges that the Taliban posed, our expectations changed from Belgium in 2 years to Bangladesh in 30. The scale of the challenges really became apparent.
Jesus! Stay still! Stay fucking still! Fuck with Bus! Bus, we gotta get him out now!
In the first 5 years of the Afghan conflict, 2 British soldiers had been killed in action. In 2006 alone, that rose to 39. A slow drumbeat of death began to roll. Ministers said the sacrifice was about keeping the streets of Britain safe by denying al-Qaeda a safe haven in Afghanistan. And yet a mission that had been intended to help stabilize Afghanistan seemed to have made it less stable.
There's no doubt that the Taliban are growing in confidence, and they're focusing their attention nowadays on Kabul.
Well, another bomb blast on the streets of Kabul. This is something that's becoming increasingly familiar.
By the start of 2007, violence had spread across much of the country, with a 7-fold increase in suicide bombings. Many were being planned and executed from Pakistan. The then US commander was General Karl Eikenberry. He had regular meetings with the Afghan president, Hamid Karzai.
Many of my conversations with him were conversations of maybe 60 minutes, and 58 minutes would be spent on Pakistan. And my view was, initially, he seems to be obsessing on this subject. But I have to tell you, as I look back on it, no, he was absolutely correct. It was a very serious problem.
I think around that time, Pakistan came to the conclusion maybe the coalition was going to be short of breath. I believe very strongly that if the coalition was not going to prevail in Afghanistan, then Pakistan wanted to make sure that they had some seat at the table.
A seat for Pakistan by using the Taliban to gain influence inside Afghanistan. The CIA concluded that America's closest ally in the region could no longer be trusted. Pakistan's intelligence service, the ISI, was playing a double game.
You want to know where the headquarters of the Afghan Taliban is? Find the headquarters of the ISI. They're in the same building. We've even had reports of Pakistani officers being killed inside Afghanistan fighting with the Afghan Taliban as expert advisors to them.
The Afghans also insist that Pakistan intelligence was protecting the Taliban leader, Mullah Omar.
They know where he is?
Of course, he is in their safe house.
Did they ever tell you where he was when you were?
I told them where he was and they got panicked. Not once, not twice, time and again.
Why did you not hand over Mullah Omar to the Americans?
He never came to Pakistan. Now that is the normal belief.
He came to Pakistan at the end of 2002.
No, I don't think so, ever.
You don't think he's even there today?
No, never. I don't think he'll be mad if he's in Pakistan.
Where do you think he is?
He will be in his own area because he dominates the area.
What, in Afghanistan?
Yes.
You think Mullah Omar is in Afghanistan?
Yes, indeed. Absolutely.
You must be the only person who does.
Well, only person, no. The people who don't believe that is probably West and United States. I don't think anyone else believes that he's in Pakistan.
By the end of 2008, many of the Bush administration's major goals for Afghanistan were in reverse. The light military footprint was heavier, 53,000 NATO troops, mostly American, and rising. Washington, once determined to avoid nation building, now spending many billions. And Pakistan, once their friend, was betraying them. America was getting sucked in deeper and deeper, and there seemed no way out. All eyes turned to a new president for fresh thinking.
Thank you so much, everybody.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everybody. We meet at one of those defining moments. A moment when our nation is at war.
We left him a very poor hand of cards with very few choices. When Mr. Obama came aboard, he was immediately faced with, be careful, don't lose Afghanistan.
The president asked me to fly with him to California in early March 2009. And after reading my report, we then spent the better part of a couple of hours going through it.
President Obama had asked Bruce Riddell to write a no-holds-barred report on the Afghan crisis, and Riddell did not pull his punches.
Defeat is what we were staring in the eye 2 years ago. Catastrophic defeat in Afghanistan, with the Taliban taking over the southern half of the country and maybe being able to march on Kabul at some point in the future, and the NATO alliance fragmenting and falling apart.
The president ordered his staff to go back to basics. What exactly were America's goals and how best to achieve them? A grueling policy review ensued. It would take 8 long months. In settings somewhat humbler than Air Force One, an equally bleak picture had been briefed to the British Prime Minister.
I was on my way home for the weekend, and I'd got to Cardiff station and just got on the train that goes up the valley, and it was packed out. And suddenly the Prime Minister was on the phone, and you can't not take a call from the Prime Minister.
Gordon Brown wanted Kim Hals's assessment of the Afghan government led by Hamid Karzai. 7 years earlier, Karzai had been seen as Afghanistan's savior.
I told him that we would find it increasingly difficult trying to argue the case for continued death and the maiming of our young people in Afghanistan when they were fighting to prop up a regime that was basically up to its eyeballs in corruption.
These mansions had sprung up in a part of Kabul exclusively reserved for Afghanistan's military and political elite. Ordinary Afghans could only wonder how such luxuries could be afforded on a government wage. In early 2009, one of the US senators overseeing America's multi-billion-dollar investment in Afghanistan confronted Karzai in the presidential palace.
The corruption in the country is rampant. Very frustrating to go there year in and year out and say, when is somebody going to jail in Afghanistan for ripping off the Afghan people? When is somebody connected to the highest narcotics dealer ever going to go to jail in this country?
You said this to the President
Absolutely,
Karzai.
just like I'm saying it to you.
At the dinner table?
Yes.
State dinner table?
Yes, how much longer are we going, the Afghan people are going to have to wait and the world going to have to wait? Do you see things change here?
This is Afghan MP Dr. Bashar Dost, famous for giving most of his salary to the poor. In 2004, he resigned as Karzai's planning minister in protest at the epic scale of corruption. Karzai offered to let Bashar Dost head a new anti-corruption commission. He agreed, but only if he could investigate Karzai's cabinet.
I said to Mr. Karzai, we must start it to fight the corruption in the staff of ministry, in the staff of presidential palace, in the Supreme Court.
What was his response?
He refused. He refused that I start the corruption in top level of Afghan state. It was the reason that he didn't accept my condition.
So you left the government?
I left the government.
In August 2009, Karzai stood for re-election.
Voting is underway in Afghanistan's presidential election.
Corruption, fraud, apathy, and the threat of attacks from the Taliban.
The allegations of vote rigging and fraud have been ringing across the cities, the valleys, and the plains of Afghanistan.
The presidential election was wreathed in corruption. Ballot boxes were stuffed with false papers. The campaigns of both frontrunners were implicated. Karzai won a second term in office. But for the West, it meant 5 more years with a partner who'd become a liability and whose state of mind was also ringing alarm bells.
President Karzai said to me several times that he suspected the British Army was involved in the drugs trade in Helmand, otherwise we could have ended it. He was sure that if we really wanted to, we could defeat the Taliban in Helmand, and we were choosing to keep the fighting going in order to give us an excuse to be there. I mean, it's an extraordinary paranoia.
Afghanistan was beginning to look like just another tin pot dictatorship. In America, on the 1st of December 2009, the president announced the results of his long-awaited Afghan review.
I want to speak to you tonight about our effort in Afghanistan and the strategy that my administration will pursue to bring this war to a successful conclusion. Increasingly brazen.
After years of drift, America seemed to set its compass. It was getting out of Afghanistan, but not before having one last crack at the Taliban.
If I did not think that the security of the United States and the safety of the American people were at stake in Afghanistan, I would gladly order every single one of our troops home tomorrow.
To reverse the Taliban's momentum, the generals told the president there'd need to be a military surge. The president sent another 30,000 troops to war. This has taken the total number of troops in Afghanistan to 142,000.
What you do today, you're going to live with that shit for the next 10, 20, 30 plus years.
This president decided that once in, he was in all the way, and that he needed to give our commanders in Afghanistan the troops they felt necessary in order to turn the situation around.
For the first time, we had, if you like, the end state quantified in military terms. Up until then, we'd just been increasing bit by bit, with never any clue of when enough was going to be enough.
The Americans decided that to secure Helmand, 30,000 troops were needed. The most Britain could supply was 10,000.
If the Americans hadn't gone into Helmand, there would have been a strategic defeat for the British Army.
Well, there would have been an inability to get our strategic objectives secured because the force levels that were required were beyond us. I mean, that's not, I think, quite the same as a strategic defeat for the British Army. It's a strategic defeat for NATO, but the British Army would have done its job magnificently.
The purpose of the surge is to clear ground held by the Taliban.
Smoke it! Get it, bitch! Oh yeah, baby! I fucking love you. Do it right. Check.
The Americans want to hand over the whole of Afghanistan to Afghan security forces by 2015. When the surge was announced, the British Foreign Secretary and his special envoy thought this was wildly ambitious.
We asked a very senior Afghan minister how long the Afghan authorities would stay in Helmand after we left. And the Foreign Secretary, David Miliband, was expecting an answer 3 years, 6 years, you know, however long it took. And the answer from this minister, very close to President Karzai, knows Helmand very well, his answer with a broad grin was 24 hours, Foreign Secretary, 24 hours.
The Americans say that since then there's been much progress from a $12 billion a year training program. Yet they're building an Afghan army and police force whose cost neither they nor the Afghans can sustain. And corruption and drug taking are still endemic, even while on guard duty. Ultimately, as long as the Afghan government lacks legitimacy with the overwhelming majority, its security forces may not be able to hold the Taliban at bay.
At the end of the day, if you're going to follow a counterinsurgency strategy, you must be true to its precept. And one of the principal precepts is, in a counterinsurgency, you're only as good as the government you represent and serve. And in this case, it's the government of Afghanistan.
That is why the Americans say that US troops will only be withdrawn from combat by 2015 if the Afghans are capable by then of taking over. Not so the British. In May last year, Britain got a new leader. Like the President, the Prime Minister says he too will withdraw combat forces by 2015.
I believe the country needs to know there is an end point to all of this. So from 2015, there will not be troops in anything like the numbers there are now, and crucially, they will not be in a combat role.
Unlike the American president, however, the Prime Minister intends to withdraw from combat by 2015 whether or not Afghan forces can prevent al-Qaeda returning to Afghanistan, even though that's always been the justification for our soldiers dying there.
If the assessment, as at the end of 2014, is that Afghanistan hasn't been hardened against the return of al-Qaeda, might that deadline have to slip?
No, the deadline is a deadline and it won't slip. We have paid a very, very large price in terms of the number of young men and indeed some young women that we've lost in Afghanistan, now over 360 people. And I think if you're going to maintain public support and backing for what we're doing, it's important to give people a clear idea that there is an end to this.
There are lots of domestic political reasons why the Prime Minister has selected that option. And we're committed ourselves as the British Army to deliver against that timeline. And whether or not it turns out to be an absolute timeline or a more conditions-based approach nearer the time, we shall find out.
So it's not an absolute commitment then, that we will get out of combat operations irrespective of the conditions on the ground?
It's certainly the intention.
The intention, yeah. But things could change.
Well, things could always change. I mean, things change weekly in politics, in strategic issues.
For some time, Britain's special representative to Afghanistan had been arguing the only way out was to start talking to the Taliban. Last summer, Sharad Cooper-Coles attended a summit of Afghan experts at Chequers, hosted by David Cameron.
Stabilizing Afghanistan isn't a question of pumping in more and more troops or training up a vast national army to garrison the country. It's arriving at a political settlement and then using military force to underpin that settlement, but not to deliver it.
The simple conclusion that we came to is that most insurgencies down history and around the world have ended in two ways. One with some military success, but secondly, with some political process and solution as well.
The new Prime Minister decided it was time to take political risks to start talking to the Taliban. Last February, Washington agreed, something they'd previously opposed. The Americans say a Taliban team, including an aide to the leader Mullah Omar, are now engaged in exploratory talks. But whilst American officials are talking to the Taliban, American special forces are also seeking out and killing many individual Taliban commanders.
In a typical 90-day period, special mission units kill or capture some 360 targeted insurgent leaders.
The Americans say that only this relentless, lethal pressure will persuade the Taliban to negotiate seriously. The Taliban say the only outcome will be yet more attacks directed at coalition forces.
They consider that the continuance of war in this country is not in the benefit of their people. But in practice, they are using their military policies, military operations against the Taliban. They are forcing Taliban to go towards the military, to a military response.
On a moonless night last month, American special forces set course for Pakistan. Their target, Osama Bin Ladin, the man the Taliban leadership still revere as the leader of the Islamic Jihad against the infidel invaders.
On nights like this one, we can say to those families who have lost loved ones to al-Qaeda's terror, justice has been done.
I couldn't be more proud. It's been a long 10 years.
The Americans may have removed bin Laden from the scene, but what of his original objectives?
The objective of September 11th was to goad the United States into invading Afghanistan. Then they could destroy an American army in Afghanistan, shatter our will at home, and lead the United States and our allies to get out of the Islamic world.
Bin Laden did provoke the longest war in America's history, and the financial cost has become unsustainable, never mind the human toll.
İnsanım da mark da para rakali da kanan, tangbom da mark da para salat, tukmom da mark şeydi.
They're going to say that we kill your women and your children, and that's not true.
So what about the coalition's war objectives? They say they've dismantled al-Qaeda's base in Afghanistan, but it's been remantled across the border in Pakistan.
We have not succeeded yet in partnering of the state of Afghanistan to ensure that al-Qaeda cannot return here.
10 years ago, we thought we could get in and out quickly. Today, we're still struggling to build an Afghan government that can stand on its own 2 feet. And now we're losing patience.
I mean, I think no one really understood, perhaps still no one really does understand the scale of the challenge we've taken on in Afghanistan. We would never, in the 19th century, have created a colony, run it for 5 or 10 years, and then said it's over to you now. But that's really what our so-called strategy in Afghanistan is.
If it's going to take 30 years to stabilize Afghanistan, let the Afghans go through those 30 years of stabilization, because we will never do it.
We have not 30 years, but just 3 years to get it finally right. The armies of the international coalition are all heading for the exits. Next week, Mark Urban tells the inside story of the bloody 5-year battle for Helmand, with unique access to the generals and frontline troops who've had to fight it.
And our series of programmes marking 10 years since the invasion of Afghanistan continues next Wednesday at 9 with the battle for Helmand.